Okay. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear us, Lori?
Sure can.
Okay, so welcome to the second week of Crop Diagnostic School 2021. We are your Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development specialists here to answer questions. Today, again, as with last week, we have David Kaminsky on the line to speak to any of your diseases questions, John Hurd to speak to any of your soil fertility questions, Dennis Lang to talk about pulses, and Kirk with cereals, John Gavlowski, the professional bugger, who's going to be speaking to your insect questions. We have Kim Brown on the line as well to speak to weeds questions. And I think that is everybody. Did I miss anyone? That's all I see on my screen right now. So, oh, John Hurd, you were muted.
What about yourself? What's your expertise, Marla?
Oh, yes. Okay. So I am Marla Rickman. Good question. I am Marla Rickman, soil health and soil management specialist, but I will just be your general moderator for these sessions. And I will answer any questions coming in soil health related, but I highly doubt that there's going to be pressing questions coming in related to soil health during these sessions, just my guess. So what we are going to do today is open things up again to questions. And so as participants on the line, you guys have a couple of different ways that you can ask questions to us. You can either type them into whether it's the chat box or the question box. If you type to the chat box, everyone will see your questions potentially. If you type to the question box, then I will be able to see what you've put in. And then the other option you have is to raise your hand, and you'll find all of that to the right side of your screen. There's that little orange arrow that can pop out the menu on the side for go to, and you'll see a little raise hand button show up there and a question button as well come up. So, or a question panel that you can open up and type into. So feel free to type up whatever questions you have again, or raise your hand, and we will get to you as we go through today. I do have, while people are kind of getting their questions prepared, I do have one comment or a question that I want to pose, and that is actually to you, Dennis. I was searching on Twitter and I saw that you were tweeting some comments about the windy conditions and beans. And of course, being the soil management person, I trigger on things related to wind erosion and the windy conditions. And so one of the things that I saw that you were talking about was that dry beans may have lost their unifoliate leaves because of sandblasting. So are we seeing, especially in the last week where we had some major wind events happening, are those beans going to regrow?
Well, that's a very good question. I started getting a few calls on Saturday because that windstorm was on Friday. And mainly in that Carmen, Darlingford, Morden area, we're on some of the sandier ground. And that wind basically just acted like a sandblasting and took off the unifoliate leaves. Now, if you examine your beans very closely, you'll notice that your main growing point, your terminal bud, where the new leaves are coming out, is still green. Those will regrow. The one cautionary note I would give you, though, is if you go out, you should go out and do some scouting, see how many good plants are left, do a plant stand assessment, and this is all dry beans that we're talking about here. Soybeans I haven't heard too much on yet, but it's dry beans that we've been focusing on. Do your stand count, see where you're at. Today would be the last possible day in zone 1 for seeding as far as crop insurance goes. So if you are somewhat debating that you might want to reseed, you need to make that call to crop insurance today to let them know, and they will give you what your options are. But if you're going back into the same crop, you can go back into the same crop, you can self-declare, but you need to clarify that with crop insurance first. Overall, though, from the pictures I've seen, it's been mostly the higher ridges that have really gotten hammered. In some instances, fields have been beat up pretty good, but you got to give it a few days to kind of recover. And especially if you're debating whether or not you should be spraying or not. Putting an added stress on that crop without having it regrow is going to be more detrimental to the crop than anything else. So let it regrow, give it a few more days. It should be fine if that growth is there. If, however, the plants are sheared off below the cotyledons, then that's a different story. Then that's when you have to actually go out and probably do some reseeding if you're going to go into the same crop. But if you want to go into something else, well, that's another story as well. So, but that's all I have to say on that one. So.
Okay, thanks. And that, like I said, that's something I think it's been top of mind for a lot of people. And I know we've seen other crops at various stages being damaged due to sandblasting, and there's a lot of times the opportunity for things to grow out, but it really, again, depends on where that damage has happened, how extensive some of that damage is.
Marla,
Yeah, go ahead, Devin.
One more thing just to add to that. Keep in mind that if you are going to reseed into beans, it is the 15th of June. So sometimes leaving the stand that's already there, even though it's thinner, might be better off than trying to start from scratch, especially if your soil is dry. So just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it also, as I'm thinking now, like we've been talking about dry conditions. Last week, dry conditions was quite a topic. The wind conditions that we ended up getting, but now we've had some rain. And considering the fact, in some areas, I should say, it's been quite spotty. I know Carmen got hammered last week with a fair bit of rain and some flooding in town. Where I am, not as much rain. I think over that 24-hour period, we didn't even get full of an inch. But considering the fact that we're seeing some moisture, I have another question here for you, David. And this is dealing with fusarium head blight, because I know the risk maps have gone up. And the question is, I'm seeing that the FHB maps are showing up as we're in the extreme category. But can you explain that? Why are we actually listed as extreme right now, considering the fact that, yeah, we've had rain, it's still not that humid, and we're not to the heading stage yet. So what's going on with that FHB risk map?
Thanks, Marla. The first thing, we posted the first map yesterday, and yes, it is shockingly red, but I put a giant disclaimer at the top of the page because there are several reasons that today the map is not showing a true indication of fusarium risk. And as you mentioned, rainfall, there was some across the whole province, and that factors into the way the model works. But you mentioned, Carmen, how we had a deluge here. We had 2 minutes in less than an hour, sorry, 2 inches in less than an hour. So streets were flooded, but it quickly dissipated, and a lot of it in fields soaked in. So surface soils are again dry just days after. All right, what else? Humidity is one of the main drivers for fusarium infection. And it has to be above 85% for that to happen. And when it's above 85%, the temperature is dipping down below the ideal range. So those two things in opposition. What's the other major factor? Oh, crop vulnerability. There's very little spring cereal crop that is in a vulnerable stage. Some is flag leaf, some is in the boot, some is just about to emerge, but I haven't seen any spring cereals that have their heads out. Rye, of course, is fully headed, and probably most of it has flowered already prior to this period where there might be some risk. And winter wheat also is close, but not out yet. So I think you'll see over the next few days that the rate or the way the map appears is going to change quite a bit. It's going to get greener as the days go on. I'm sorry that the map doesn't always give a true indication of what the risk is.
Well, and that's not uncommon with maps when the scale of information that's kind of supporting the maps is quite broad, right? And especially if we're dealing with things like rain, it's so spotty, especially when it's coming from storm conditions, right? And
Yes,
storm events.
absolutely.
And so it really is hard to get a good value for what is actually happening on smaller scales within the landscape. And that's why it is kind of a general disease risk or general risk maps, right?
Yeah, and we also had unprecedented dry conditions up to the point where the rain came. We've never seen a year like this. So humidity isn't driven by either the plants giving off moisture or the soil giving off moisture. It's still dry.
So still on a theme of dry soils and maybe / wet soils, this question came in and I'm going to pose it to you, Dane, as well as to John, because it's going to be related to fertilizer and top dressing. But this is specific, the question was specific to sunflowers. And so, Dane, have you top dressed sunflowers? The person who posted said, we've applied low fertilizer in spring because of conditions, because it was dry, obviously, and they weren't sure of how they would pull through the dry soil conditions, but now the fertilizer needs to go on. So do you have experience with top dressing fertilizer in sunflowers? Take it away, and then John can add if he's got some additional comments.
Sure. Limited experience. I mean, sunflowers are not a broadacre crop like they are in other areas. So top dressing really depends on what product the farmer wants to use. If they're looking at a broadcast urea application, that can lead to some issues, particularly as sunflowers up, and that whorl on the top of the plant can experience some fairly severe nitrogen burn if urea gets trapped in those whorls, similar to if you were to do it with corn. Generally, when folks are top dressing sunflowers, it's either using UAN or mid-row banding with anhydrous. I would suspect UAN is going to be the preferred route. It certainly can be done. And if we have a little more moisture coming, hopefully, there should be enough moisture to move that UAN into the ground. However, if there's not, using something like an agritain or a nitrogen stabilizer just to prevent that nitrogen product from gassing off and volatilizing under these hot, windy, very sunny conditions will be important. Sunflowers will cover up that row fairly quickly, so it is important to get on there and place it as close to the row as you can down by the base. A wide drop system works really well for something like that. If you're leaving it in the middle of the furrow, try and put it underneath the soil rather than leaving it on the surface using a disc opener or something to knife it in, maybe better. Sunflower root systems are still fairly small, but they are tapping down right now. They're not moving laterally quite so much. In another 2 to 3 leaf pairs, they'll really start to stretch out and start to grab those that mid-row nitrogen.
Marla, my comments are, I'm a big fan of side dressing or putting UAN or anhydrous ammonia down between the rows. That's why we grow them in wide rows, is so that we can side dress, spoon feed the nitrogen in season. I should mention I was out to a cornfield last week, and I'm very impressed with some of the hardware people are pulling also, so that they're ensuring slot closure. We have measured losses and crop damage in the past where there's poor closure of those slots, and any manner of hardware that will either discs that will close in that slot or firmers, I think are advantageous. But yes, that's my notion, is that sunflowers, corn, great opportunities for side dressing with ammonia, or as Dane mentioned, with UAN liquid. My comments were at Diagnostic School in other years. We've diddled with some of these misapplications, and yeah, 28% on sunflower leaves is crispy critters. So keep the 28% off the leaves, like the Y drops, like Dane suggested.
What stage do we want to be targeting at this point?
Sunflowers become critical users of nitrogen a little bit later on in life, V6 to V8, generally, those leaf pairs. But what we want to see is nitrogen go on before we start damaging the plant. Sunflowers broaden out and spread in that row fairly quickly, and any in-crop application, we tend to see cultivator blight or some sort of machinery blight later on. So earlier tends to be better in this case, just to prevent crop damage.
And
Okay.
I like to see whenever you can start seeing the rows well, because in this part of the world, Manitoba, sometimes we get too wet to side dress. So if the soil is fit and you can see the rows to drive between, get to it.
Yep.
With corn or sunflowers, just get the job done now while it's dry.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially because
Yeah,
we can't predict what's coming, it seems. Apparently sunflowers are the theme of this morning so far, and we're getting other questions coming in. Should I be using a liquid fertilizer like 624-6 for a pop-up starter in the furrow when seeding sunflowers?
And we're talking 2022 now. So you got a lot of time to make up that decision, but sunflowers are pretty sensitive to seed place fertilizer. So low amounts, yeah, it's the phosphorus I care about more than the other nutrients in there. And so, yes, you've got lots of time to do some plumbing and get ready for 2022.
Okay, I think that's it for our sunflower questions so far anyway. I'm switching gears to insects, John G. Because, I mean, flea beetles have also been top of mind this year, that's for sure. And that's full of fascinating photos in my Twitter feed also of flea beetle damage this year. So a question regarding control. If I can't get my flea beetle insecticide on during the day because of the weather or whatever else, can my insecticide applications for flea beetles be done at night?
Short answer is yes. And the longer answer to this, there's always trade-offs, pros and cons. Obviously, you want to get as good contact as you can, which means doing it when the flea beetles are up on the plants, which is usually during the day on hot, dry, calm days. So evening time, we really don't know a lot about flea beetle behavior in the evening, how much time they spend on the plants, how good contact you would get. But what I suggest is if it's something that is more practical to do, either because of weather restrictions, hot day and you can't apply a pyrethroid, or you've got other things on the go during the day, evening can work, or very early morning. There was a study that Bob Elliott in Ag Canada, Saskatoon did, where he was spraying flea beetles, so he would get contact with them, but not letting them feed on the plants. And then he was putting flea beetles on plants that had just been treated, but there was absolutely no contact with the insecticide and the flea beetle. So one was ingestion only, one was contact only. He actually got better kill with the ingestion treatment than the contact treatment. So even if you don't get good contact, you still do get kill through ingestion. And he used daltemethrine in that study, which is a pyrethroid, and he had another group, the spinosines, in that study as well. So you do get some ingestion kill if you do have to spray in the evening. You still can get probably at least satisfactory control doing it that way.
Okay.
Say, John, are you going to actually get better use out of your pyrethroid if you spray at night because it's cooler? Because I know there's the caution out there. You don't want to be using it during the hot temperatures.
Yeah, and good point. And again, there's all kinds of trade-offs when we do this, but that could be one that works in your favor. If the temperatures are getting into the high 20s and into the 30s, you don't want to be out there spraying in the day anyway. You need to wait till much later in the day when it cools off. So yes, that's another potential reason you would want to spray later, potentially in the evening, just to get it done when the temperature is cooler.
John, are there certain classes of insecticides that are more tolerant to heat and or sunlight breakdown than others?
Oh, good question. And the tricky part in answering that is it's often more than just sunlight and heat. There's moisture is often a factor. Sometimes soil microbes. There's all kinds of things that affect the breakdown. So I really couldn't pick a class, and it varies with products within a class too. So I really couldn't suggest a class that's going to, I guess, be more stable or have more residual in overall anyway. Pyrethroids for sure under heat, they just don't work as well. That's well known. But no, it's a tough question, Dane, and there's so many factors involved. It's a really hard one to answer.
Fair enough. Figured I'd throw it out there. Thanks.
It's hard to get your hands on DDT anymore, Dane.
Yeah, before my time, I heard it was good in some instances.
Oh my. Okay, so since we're talking spraying, essentially, I've got a couple questions here regarding cereals. The first one I'm going to throw at Kim, who I hope is still on our line here. Okay, so if I am dealing with being kind of at the end of the spraying stage for my cereals in terms of like the stage of the crop itself, but now with that last week's rain, I'm getting this new flush of weeds. How long can I wait to spray? Assuming here that they haven't sprayed yet, I think.
Yeah, and that's just a really really tough issue this year because our crops are, some of them are a lot further along than you think in their life stage, even though they're extremely short. A lot of our wheat varieties are dwarfs or semi-dwarfed varieties anyway, so they are quite short. But we've seen fields now that are below the knee at flag leaf and, you know, on starting to poke out in some of those cases. So we are at flag leaf or very close to flag leaf. So you really have to obey the crop staging parameters that the pesticides are registered for. If your herbicide says up to flag, that's as far as you can go. Once you spray beyond that, you can risk crop damage, but you also could be risking the MRLs, or the maximum residue limits that are set for that herbicide. There needs to be a certain time from the time that is sprayed, like the pre-harvest interval has to be obeyed. So I know that we do have a flush of weeds just coming. You cannot wait for those. You have to obey the crop staging for a number of reasons. But honestly, with the rain, I think our crops really have filled out more. They're not necessarily getting that much taller, some of them, but they are filling out more. So we're seeing a little bit more row closure and stuff. So we're hoping that a good competitive crop will choke out some of those weeds. And if those weeds are choked out when they're small, they won't be competitive and they won't be taking away from yield and that type of thing.
Okay, and related then to what you've been just talking about with flag leaf, this question is for you, Anne. How do I actually properly stage flag leaf because my wheat crop is so stagey?
Sure. So like what Kim was saying, that you want to make sure that the crop isn't at flag leaf. So if you do have a stagey crop, you should be wandering around, checking quite a few plants to see where they are. So when flag leaf emerges, there should be 3 nodes visible above the soil surface. So I'd pull a few plants, take off all the tillers, because you should really only be looking at your main stem. The first node is probably 1.5 inches or 2 inches above the soil surface. The second node will be about 4 inches or so above that, but obviously if we have short wheat, it'll be a shorter distance. And then the third node will be above that second node. So once that third node is visible, then flag leaf is starting to emerge. If you're not, you can also, take a sharp knife, cut into the stem, and if you see the head but no additional leaves found inside, then the flag leaf is emerging, because that will be the last leaf, obviously, before the head emerges. Some other people recommend doing things like counting leaves, but it can be a bit tricky because, well, wheat usually would have 8 leaves, and the 8th would be your flag leaf. It could, variety or the dryness could change that a little bit. So I think it's best to, look for that third node and then also cut into your stem to see what's inside.
Okay, thanks. And still on cereals, but switching gears back to fertility, John Hurd. Again, we've talked a bit about this in the split application today already with sunflowers, and you've mentioned a little bit on corn and timing and how to get that down, basically getting it down when you can. So people who were holding back on putting nitrogen down with their cereal crops because it was so dry, when do they now want to target that split nitrogen application in order to feed that crop now that we've had some moisture?
Well, after the lesson I just had from Ann here that I wrote down your inches and things, it's now. The studies that were done in the past in Manitoba that showed very good success with in-season nitrogen, the latter window on that was flag leaf emergence. So now is the stage where we would like to have that nitrogen on, preferably in the soil. So at this point, no use putting it on if there isn't rain. I would still stage it for rain, but we're getting close to that point where we want to have it on if we're still looking for yield plus protein benefit. Anything that goes on further once the head's emerged is going to go primarily towards any protein benefit. So for people using that strategy, that risk management strategy of withholding some nitrogen, yeah, now is the time you would like to have that in place. Some growers, as we spoke before, might have been saying, you know, yield potential is already reduced, and they may be looking to withhold some of that anyways. That's an assessment the farmer and agronomist need to make based on their moisture. You know, is that yield potential low enough? Is that split warranted, or should I back off that split? Tough decision, but now's the time for that one.
Okay. We've kind of covered all the questions that have come in thus far, unless any other conditions. Question coming in here around corn staging. I spoke too soon. Corn staging for herbicide application. What method is best to be using for staging corn for herbicide? I guess I'm going to flip that either to Anne or to Kim. Anne, do you want to start with it?
Sure, I can start. Herbicide labels are confusing for staging for corn. They do use different methods, so it's just important to make sure you read your label properly to ensure that you know what they're actually talking about. Some labels say inches for height, some say 2-leaf, some say 4-leaf color. So those are obviously, when people talk about leaves, it's unsure if they're talking about leaf over, which is you only count leaves that have actually curved and are pointing back towards the ground, or if it's the number of leaves that you actually see poking out of the whorl. Some use, you know, the leaf color method, like the V stages. So they might say, you know, V4 stage. So you're actually looking for that leaf, the colors where the leaf is attached to the stem. And that's a lot easier to tell if you're at the right stage or not. If there's the same herbicide that's doing 2 different methods, just look to see which, you know, it might say a certain number of inches, 8 inches, or V4. Look to see whichever it reaches first. I wouldn't say, oh, my corn is at V6, but it's only 8 inches tall. That's not obviously a good method. So make sure you're kind of looking at whatever stage it reaches first. But just make sure you're reading your label properly to know which method or method of staging they're actually referring to.
Yeah, those are really good points, Anne. Thanks. Those are really good points, Anne. Check your herbicide labels because they are all a little bit different. Some of them do go by the V stages. And generally in corn, because it's so not competitive until much later in its life, which is up to the V8 or V10 stage, the critical weed-free period in corn is very long. Early weed control is critical. We've got some really good pre-emerge products that have some residual in them that'll keep that corn clean at the very beginning of its life cycle there. And then you can come back with some in-crop products, but you're always better to go into corn on the early side. It's just a lot safer on the corn usually. And it just really helps us get those weeds out and maintain that critical weed-free period.
Spray early and spray often.
Yes, that's a very good thing with corn. There is absolutely no reason not to be spraying it twice. Most of our corn is glyphosate tolerant. We've got Liberty, we've got stacked corn as well with some Liberty in there. So we've got some really, really great options. And we also have some really good post-emergent and pre-emergent as well, but products that are from some different herbicide groups. We've got some good group 27 chemistry, which is really nice to use in our fight against herbicide resistant weeds. And so we do have a lot of really good products in corn.
I feel like because we're now hitting our half-hour mark, I feel like we're ending with a few good mottos. Right, John? Spray early, spray often in corn. Corn is a wimp. We know that. That's fine when it's young. And then the other one that Anne mentioned today was always read your label, which is another really important thing to always keep in mind, because this is where you get that very important information whether you're dealing with staging, timing, all of that kind of stuff. So I am going to call it morning for us here in our second CDS week. And we are going to see you guys back here next week. Again, bring your questions. You can always email your questions in advance if you like as well. And it's good seeing you, even though it's not in person. And we will see you again next week with more answers for your questions from the field. Thanks a lot, everybody, and take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.